Welcome to Burning Books. Many of you have been here before. Thank you very much. And I also want to thank everyone who has contributed to making this happen. Like we say every time, we can't do this without your support. It was a lot of support that came from the community to make this happen. We flew Will in from DC. And these types of things don't typically happen at little friendly neighborhood radical bookstores like this, so it's a big deal. All of your contribution to what we're doing here, you're all a part of Burning Books, and we really appreciate it. Thank you very much. A year after the Operation Backfire arrests happened, there was an anniversary event dealing with the Green Scare, with the repression of environmental activists. Let's see. And I was brought out to Minneapolis because I was the spokesperson, former spokesperson for ELF, so I was brought out to Minneapolis for a big event they were filming there, and that was the first time I ever saw, met, or heard of Will. And I remember I first got there, and I'm already familiar with the activists there. They had brought me out there a few times already, and I was like, oh, who's on the panel tonight? And they're like, oh, there's a local attorney that's dealing with this case and that case, and then there's some other guy. And I was like, who's this other guy? And they're like, oh, Will something. And I was like, okay, who's this Will guy? And I kept asking people, I asked like 3 or 4 people, finally somebody was like, he does a blog. And so that's what I knew when I sat down at the panel with him, and we all did, about 15 minutes, and we had a discussion. It was a great event. And as soon as we were done, I immediately realized that this guy, he does a blog, does not come anywhere near doing him justice. He does amazing work. He does consistent, hard-working, amazing work. It's now 2013. It's been 7 years since then. I don't know how long he was at it before then, but he is consistently doing good work in the press, getting word out about how corporations are manipulating laws to repress activists, particularly environmentalists and animal rights activists. And his name is it's really spread. He does amazing work. I'm super impressed with him, and I'm super excited to have him here tonight. He's, as you'll see, he's really got a lot to offer. Everyone, including myself, is going to leave here with a lot more information in our heads, I expect, than we came here with. And with that, I want to give a warm Buffalo welcome to Will Potter. Thank you.
If I stand down here, do I need to be up behind the... Doesn't matter to anyone? All right. Thank you all so much for coming out. I know there's a lot of things competing for everyone's time and energy on a daily basis, so it means a lot to have a packed space like this. And thanks to Leslie and everyone at Burning Books for bringing me out here. I mean, I do a lot of speaking events, but it's really rare around the country to have vibrant community spaces like this that are not just places to pick up radical literature and alternative information, but to have community spaces and gathering and coming together for this and many other events. So I'm really fortunate to be in a space like this, and I hope you all appreciate it, how lucky you are to have space like this in your community, and you do whatever you can to be involved and come out to events and volunteer and financially support if you can, because it really does mean a lot. So what I'm going to be talking about tonight is what I've focused on, as Leslie said, for about the last 10 or 11 years. I think it's best if I kind of give a little bit of an introduction of how I got involved in this issue, because it's usually people's first question. I was working as a reporter at the Chicago Tribune, covering breaking news and what in newspapers we often call cop shop reporting. Dead bodies and shootings on the south side of Chicago, city council meetings, breaking news. And doing this day after day, it was leaving me really feeling pretty dark and depressed. I mean, it wasn't the type of work I went into journalism striving to do. It wasn't making me feel like I had any positive difference on the world in any way. And I had a background in a lot of different social justice movements in college back in Texas, in animal rights and environmental issues, prisoner support work, protesting the WTO in Seattle in 1999. And I knew I couldn't really be an activist working as a journalist, but I thought I could go out leafleting with a group of activists on a campaign against an animal testing company. And that's all we did. We hung door knockers. And we were arrested and charged with disorderly conduct. But the important part of that story was a couple weeks later I was visited at home by 2 FBI agents. And they threatened to put me on a domestic terrorist list unless I helped them by becoming an informant and infiltrating animal rights and environmental groups. And, you know, as someone who had a background in social justice organizing,
Did you say for hanging door knockers?
ringing door knockers. And so that was my reaction. This was only a couple months after September 11th. And as anyone, you know, I'm sure most of you all who have a familiarity with social justice movements, you know things like this happen. And if you're anything like me, when you've read about past cases like that, you know, I would like to think that in that situation, I would kind of throw 2 middle fingers in the air, kind of turn around and walk off into the sunset, that kind of thing, right? No fear, no remorse, no concern whatsoever. And I was really ashamed by the fact that it affected me. You know, it made me afraid. It made me wonder what actually was going to happen. I mean, a couple months after 9/11, what does this mean, being put on a domestic terrorist list? They said they would make sure I didn't receive a Fulbright I had pending. My girlfriend at the time wouldn't get her graduate school funding. Like, they knew everything about me, everything about my parents. So the long story short is, after that fear subsided, I really became obsessed with finding out how animal rights and environmental activists became, according to the FBI, the #1 domestic terrorism threat. Now, this isn't just empty rhetoric and statements from people like John Lewis, the FBI Deputy Assistant Director. When the FBI lists on its website Osama bin Laden when he was alive, obviously, alongside Daniel Andreas San Diego, who is believed to be a fugitive animal rights activist, it sends a very clear message to the public. But before we talk about that, I think we really need to talk about who is not the #1 domestic terrorism threat, because we have to situate this in the broader political climate right now. And the people who are not the #1 domestic terrorism threat are people like Joe Stacks, who flew a plane into the IRS building in my hometown of Austin, Texas, hurting himself and many other people in protest of government tax policy. This is the Huttery militia out of Michigan. They're a self-proclaimed Christian warriors. You can see here they're proud to be armed. They were waging what they would call a holy war, targeting judges, targeting people for being Muslim. And you can't talk about political violence in this country without talking about the anti-abortion movement. People have murdered doctors, murdered nurses. And it includes signs like this, not to say that that type of First Amendment activity should be prohibited, but to give you an idea in the context of the movements I'm going to be talking about in a moment, what would happen if you had people that were protesting while at the same time other people in that movement were actually murdering people in cold blood. And if there's one incident on U.S. soil that most people in law enforcement, at least, would consider domestic terrorism, it'd be the bombing of the Oklahoma City building in the 90s. Killed hundreds of people. Timothy McVeigh was one of the people responsible. Homeland Security Director of Pennsylvania, James Powers, said, quote, "Tim McVeigh is not a terrorist, he's just, quote, very angry with the U.S. government." So it's this type of speech that it seems funny and it seems outlandish, but it, as I'll talk about tonight, it's really worked its way into every levels of government, where far-right groups, no matter what types of violence they're engaged in, are consistently not labeled as terrorists. This is a report from West Point, which is not exactly a bastion of leftist, anarchist, animal rights and environmental activist thinking, right? And they did the most exhaustive study on right-wing violence that's ever been conducted. And they documented a 400% increase in extremist attacks by right-wing groups since 1990 to 2011. Now, I had some issues with this study because it lumps together property destruction with physical violence, and that's something that I definitely take issue with. But even if you just look at physical violence, you see this dramatic spike, especially since around 2006. 65% of that has been against ethnic and religious minorities. 14% of it is against people because of their sexual orientation. Now, these aren't just concerns from people like me. And it's not just an aberration. As part of my research for the book, I went through and tried to document the history of this chronology. And what we see is that the FBI has either been miscalculating or minimizing right-wing violence, while at the same time exaggerating and inflating the threat of leftist groups. In the last terrorism report it produced from 2002 to 2005, the FBI says that in the 3 years after 9/11, every single act of domestic terrorism except for one was the work of environmental activists. In that same period, I was able to document right-wing violence that resulted in 283 injuries and 71 deaths. As I was researching the book, I went through every Inspector General report from the Justice Department, which is a wild and exciting way to spend Friday and Saturday nights. But you find some interesting things in there that don't usually make the news, and one of them was an Inspector General report from 2003, in which they said that the FBI's mission of preventing attacks and violence against people, ostensibly, would be enhanced if the counterterrorism unit didn't spend time and money on social protesters. That's just like straight out of my talking points, right? This is the Justice Department advising this, sending a letter to the FBI. The FBI wrote a letter back and said no. They didn't say much more than that. They said no because we think this is the best way to go about it. Barack Obama, when he was a senator in 2005, raised similar concerns. He said that while he objects to crimes by the Animal Liberation Front and Earth Liberation Front, he cautioned Congress against inflating them to the level of terrorists. And he said, while he appreciates the chairman's concerns, he urges the committee to focus its attention on larger environmental threats. This has even worked its way into, in 2012, just last year, a report from the Congressional Research Service, this is the nonpartisan investigative arm of Congress. So members of Congress, when they're investigating and debating issues, this is one of their go-to resources. And this report actually cites my work repeatedly, raises these exact same concerns, and calls for congressional hearings to investigate why the FBI is focusing so much time and money on environmental activists. And again, members of Congress refused. So it begs the question, how do we get to this point when environmental activists are being labeled the #1 domestic terrorism threat when they've never harmed a human being? And in fact, the most radical groups like the ALF and the ELF have stated goals in mission statements of never never injuring humans or non-human animals. So who is the #1 domestic terrorism threat? It's groups like Earth First, who have done things like blockade roads and protest of the logging of old-growth forests. People like the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society that steer small inflatable boats between the whalers' harpoons in the Southern Ocean and the whales to physically put their bodies on the line. This was a protest in Italy of a daylight raid on an animal testing laboratory where the crowd gathered at this facility, and there were thousands of people, and they were so inspired by their own power and energy that people began climbing over the barbed wire fences in the middle of the day and lifting up beagle puppies over the fence with the police standing right there. And more extreme, we have underground groups like the Animal Liberation Front that have a history of breaking into laboratories, breaking into fur farms, releasing animals from those facilities, destroying property because they say that property is used to harm the animals and to carry out that torture, and inflicting economic damage. They've also done things like release video footage to above ground lawful groups like PETA, who have then engaged with the media about it. At the absolute most extreme in these movements have been acts of arson, and this is really an iconic image from the Earth Liberation Front, the arson of a Vail ski resort. And even in situations like this, when we're burning down and causing millions of dollars of damage, in the history of these movements, such precautions were taken that they never harmed a human being, according to the FBI. So really the question I want to put to you all tonight, and that I'm going to hope to answer, is how did we get to this point where nonviolent activists who are putting their bodies on the line are being investigated as terrorists, but people that are murdering hundreds of people in the name of their politics or not. And so I started using this analogy of comparing what's going on today with the Red Scare, simply because if there's one era of US history I think most people in this country identify as a dark mark, on our past. It's the Red Scare. It's singling out people for being communist or suspected communist or anarchist and demonizing them because of their politics. Now, I'm not arguing that what's going on today is exactly the same as what happened then, because it's not. But I think the value of a metaphor and a comparison like this is it helps shine a light and brings new information and new understanding to the things that are being compared. And I think we have to situate this in that broader pattern of government repression. So what I want to put forward tonight is that what's going on right now is not only it's similar to the Red Scare, it's similar to every period of government and corporate repression throughout US and world history. And what I want to try to do is identify what I think are the shared elements of a lot of those periods. And I would argue that there's really been 10 key steps in turning activists into terrorists. The first and most important has been to use the power of language. Right? If there's one thing we remember about the Red Scare, it was Joseph McCarthy standing up with his list of names saying, we know who are the suspected communists. It was using that rhetoric over and over and over again to instill fear. Now the rhetoric we have available to politicians and law enforcement now is obviously post 9/11. It's this rhetoric of terrorism. As these movements were emerging in the early 1980s in their modern form, we need to remember that the animal rights and environmental movements were growing very quickly and very boldly. You had headlines like this in the LA Times in 1986 about sabotage, about Earth First, saying environmental warriors are using radical tactics to make a point. They were regarded as heroes, as environmental vigilantes, as saviors. Similarly, you had groups like PETA in their newsletter in 1985 publicly supporting militant underground groups like the Animal Liberation Front, even including reasons why you should support the Animal Liberation Front. And this is an expose of one of their raids of UC Riverside. They took this primate named Britches out of the laboratory. He had his eyes completely sewn shut and really became an iconic symbol of the animal liberation movement. Corporations had a problem, because when you have bold movements that have public support and that are also unified, supporting above ground and underground activists, they needed to displace them from that moral high ground. So what they began to do is shift the language, shifted away from monkey wrencher and hero and vigilante, away from saboteur, away from even criminal, which is completely accurate in a lot of these cases, not all of them. But they created a new word, they just made it up in 1985, called eco-terrorist. And over the next 30 years, they used that language relentlessly in media campaigns. So here's a good example of how this works. As soon as people are arrested, the Department of Justice and FBI put out press releases instantly branding them as terrorists. So before you even have the chance to set foot in a courtroom, before you even plead guilty or not guilty or have a trial date set, you're already having these mechanisms that are starting to go about labeling you as a terrorist. The mainstream press, for the most part, has just gone along with it without question. You have headlines like in the Washington Post, on the front page, in 2005, when a group of environmental activists were rounded up by the FBI, the press releases came out, and the Washington Post ran a headline, 11 indicted in eco-terrorism cases, instantly setting public opinion against them, and I would argue ensuring that it's impossible to get a fair trial. You also had paid media campaigns. So here's a good example of how this works. This was from the early 1980s from the fur industry. They were taking out full-page advertisements in newspapers saying, meet the world's newest terrorist. Don't tolerate terrorism in America. Fur is for life. And so you have kind of the Steve Urkel, slash Williamsburg hipster kind of character, right? With the balaclava and the axe and the whole thing. 2006, none of the images have changed. They're using the same ideas. Now Steve Urkel apparently has a leather jacket, which is interesting because animal rights activists probably don't wear leather. All right. That's lost on, I guess, the ad industry folks. But they're saying that a campaign called Stop Hunting and Animal Cruelty, which I'll talk about in a little bit, is holding Wall Street hostage. Hostage, right? That's a very specific meaning when you're talking about terrorism. Holding Wall Street hostage by protesting and knocking a corporation from the New York Stock Exchange. They've also done really outlandish things, like when there's movies that are sympathetic to environmentalists, such as Hoot, which involved kids sabotaging bulldozers, because kids tend to like animals, and movies about animals, right? Kind of like Free Willy. So this was a popular kid book and kids movie. And they sent out press releases saying it's softcore eco-terrorism for kids. But this stuff got picked up. It got picked up in mainstream media outlets. They ran full-page ads. This one's from the New York Times, one of the most expensive media markets in the country. And you have this kind of 6 degrees of separation Kevin Bacon. Remember that game? You know, how do we connect ourselves to Kevin Bacon? Or the movie characters or whatever it was. So they're connecting the Humane Society to terrorism. And you can't see all the details, but the abridged version is that members of the Humane Society went to a holiday party of a group called the Humane League in Baltimore. Humane League had former members of another group called Hugs for Puppies. Some members of Hugs for Puppies were members of another group at one time called Stop Hunting and Animal Cruelty Philadelphia. Shack Philadelphia had members that were at one time affiliated with the Shack National Campaign. And finally, members of the Shack National Campaign, 6 of them, were convicted of conspiring to commit animal enterprise terrorism. So obviously, the Humane Society is a terrorist organization. This is by far my all-time favorite image that I refuse to take up any presentation I give. This is from the National Rifle Association, and we really begin to see why animal rights activists are such a threat. And it's in part because they've taught owls to carry dynamite. They've taught lobsters to crawl on land. And the most damning is that none of the women shave their legs. But if you notice, the men do. So, as all that nonsense is going on, there are government hearings being held to legitimize what's an illegitimate argument, an illegitimate threat. And this is an example of how they do it. They hold these congressional hearings on, this one was eco-terrorism and lawlessness in the national forest. And I testified before one of these about the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. And I was invited to speak as a journalist. And, you know, part of me, you know, you live in DC and you know that this is all a political spectacle. You know it's absurd. But part of me was like, all right, I'm going to testify before Congress. I'm going to talk about my work, right? It's kind of ego-stroking. You feel like you might be kind of making a difference. And then you get there and you realize that's not at all what this is about. Because, you know, it's me sitting down next to the FBI and Department of Justice and GlaxoSmithKline. And how do you think this all works out? Well, we're here to investigate whether or not we should pass the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. What do you think, Department of Justice? What do you think, FBI? What do you think, GlaxoSmithKline? What do you think, Will Potter? Oh, that's great. What do you think, GlaxoSmithKline? What do you think, FBI? And it just keeps going like that the whole time. And I mean, not to get derailed into that, but I was told I was invited by the Democrats, and I was told I could make some minor suggestions about the legislation. I said, okay, I'll make minor suggestions. And I didn't say that at all. I said the law had to be abolished, and this is part of a witch hunt, compared it to the Red Scare and all this other stuff. It doesn't matter. It's all political theater, and the purpose of the political theater is that there's media outlets writing about it. Congressional record now documents this hearing. The question about should we have eco-terrorism laws is answered by the corporate representatives in the FBI, and it legitimizes the threat. Does that make sense? It moves it forward. And as all this is going on, there are campaigns to divide the movement. And not to get too geeky here with my horizontal and vertical axis, but I think it's really helpful in thinking about and conceptualizing social movements. So I would argue that the animal rights and environmental movements exist horizontally alongside other social justice movements. Black liberation, prison abolition, women's rights groups, GLBT, gay liberation, all these other groups that I would argue, they don't always overlap, but kind of moving in the same direction, or at least trying to, right? And there's natural differences that I'm sure for people in this room know we tend to exacerbate on our own because of our own politics or our own differences and unwillingness to learn about other movements and recognize privilege and problems that we have. But then outsiders try to magnify those differences. So you hear rhetoric from these corporations about, you don't want to deal with these animal rights activists. They're just nuts. They want to make sure you can't even have a hamburger anymore. You can't go to the circus. You can't wear what you want to wear. You can't wear leather. The environmentalists want to make you use these crappy light bulbs that don't even work very well, and you can't drive your car anymore. It's like they're just redefining our culture, right? And there's truth to all of those things. But the way it's presented is that they're over here, and the rest of the so-called left is over here. And as that's going on, you have what I would call a vertical fragmentation. So you have members of Congress that actually sent letters to national nonprofits saying that unless you condemn radical activists, both their tactics and what they believe, unless you say publicly what they believe is wrong, we're going to investigate your tax-exempt status as a nonprofit. So if you're the head of a nonprofit trying to do good work, right, and you're being threatened to lose all of that, lose all your membership, lose all your organizing, unless you come out and condemn someone that's already being marginalized, that can be tempting to a lot of people. And it happened a lot.
I didn't see that on Fox News.
So as that's happening, you have, as you're fragmenting people horizontally, fragmenting them vertically, what do you have? You have people that are isolated. And when people are isolated, these tactics can continue much more swiftly and forcefully. We all know that surveillance is going on, right? Especially in the last, you got a sneak peek there. Especially in the last, was just the last week, Glenn Greenwald had these great stories exposing yet another NSA program that's compiling information in real time from Google, Facebook, Verizon, chat logs, pen traps, which are the incoming and outgoing calls, and just like a vacuum, just sucking up all of this information when they don't even know what they're going to do with it, just sucking up everybody's personal information. So we know that's happening. I think most people are unaware to the extent to which that actually occurs on a daily basis. And if you're familiar with Burning Bergston and everything that Leslie's been going through, well, over many years, but in the last, year or so, it takes on a special resonance. I'm sure we can talk about that later as well. But there's a lot of it that we never see the extent of the surveillance that's actually taking place. This is an example from the UK where a cop named Mark Kennedy or Mark Stone infiltrated environmental groups for years to the point where he was having sexual relationships with environmental activists who had no idea that he was actually a cop. So here's Mark, the cop, and here's Mark, the anarchist, with his do-rag and bad tattoos and, cool ponytail. And it looks silly when you juxtapose it in this way, but this went on for years. And I gave some speaking events in Berlin and in Hamburg, Germany. And we found out later on that he had actually registered when he was still undercover and was attempting to attend. And it's just one example of, he was everywhere throughout Europe, everywhere, working with law enforcement in many different countries.
What does that mean, still registered?
He had registered in an attempt to attend the conference. Here's an example I found out about through the Freedom of Information Act. The Counterterrorism Unit was actually monitoring my website, books, speaking engagements, correspondence I had with prisoners, interviews I've given. And, in part I highlighted it because some of the things they say in these documents are nice things about the book. They actually say it's compelling and well written. So this will be my pitch that if the Counterterrorism Unit thinks it's compelling and well written, I hope you'll pick up a copy from Burning Books. Was it $16.95? You could talk to Leslie.
Some pretty bad books.
Hey, you're messing up my pitch here. So as people actually work their way through the legal system and they get to the point of facing a trial or a sentence, It's really important that they're sentenced disproportionately. Here's an example of that. Marie Mason is an environmental activist who destroyed property in the opposition to genetic engineering. She was sentenced as a terrorist under the terrorism enhancement penalty to 22 years in prison. Let that sink in for a moment. 22 years. The average sentence for arson is about 6 to 7 years under the sentencing guidelines, and just based on what people actually receive. 22 years. This is Michael Contreras. He went out with a group of friends on the election night of President Barack Obama, and they had pipes and batons, and they beat up black people and people who they thought were black, who thought they had voted for the first black president. They ran over someone with their car because they suspected that he was African American. Turns out he wasn't. They ran him over anyway. Him and his friends were sentenced to between 4.5 and 9 years. So, political violence, racist violence, 4.5 years. Nonviolent property destruction, which, I mean, these are serious crimes. I'm not saying it's not a crime. But I think when you put them side by side like this, it really gives a clear indication of the priorities of our culture right now. This is Tim DeChristopher. Do you all know about Tim's case? Anybody heard about it a little bit? So Tim is, well, as a University of Utah undergraduate student, he heard about an auction where public lands were being auctioned off to corporations for just pennies on the dollar. And so someone told Tim about it. He went in, and he had no intention of doing anything, but he saw this sham taking place. And he started raising his bidder's paddle. You know, $1,000, $5,000, $10,000. And Tim knew he didn't have any money. I mean, he's just a college student, right? He kept doing it to disrupt the spectacle. And it worked. I mean, it cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars. By the way, that auction was later ruled illegal by a federal court. It was thrown out. So someone who disrupted an illegal corporate auction was sentenced to 2 years in prison for that act of civil disobedience. Tim's out now, and he's given a couple of interviews, and he's beginning to work his way back into environmental organizing as well.
Didn't he say through donations he raised enough funds to pay for it anyways?
I believe so, that's right. And there's a new documentary about him as well called Bidder 70. That's really good if people want to check out. In terms of legal cases, the only way the government has been able to build significant legal cases against environmental and animal rights activists is by turning what I would call snitches and informants. And that's all done through the power of fear. So here's a good example of how this works. This is Jake Ferguson. Jake is an environmental activist in the Northwest. The cops thought they had some information about his involvement in some property destruction. They hauled him in and they said, "Jake, we know what you're up to." Jake said, "Oh shit," thought about it for a half of a second, and then said, "Okay, I'm willing to compromise." He thought they just knew about him being a heroin addict and his involvement in some minor property destruction. Or, excuse me, back up for a second. I completely said that incorrectly. Government knew he was a heroin addict and thought he was involved in some minor property destruction. Jake thought they knew that he was the most prolific arsonist in the history of the Earth Liberation Front, as far as what we know. It turns out he gave them more than they could ever have hoped for. He agreed to wear a wire, travel the country, talk to his former friends, and get them to talk on audio about what they did years and years ago, 10 years ago. And that's the only way, according to the government, according to the FBI, that they were able to build the largest domestic terrorism investigation in U.S. history. Because of the fear that was sewn into a heroin addict who is now went back to jail on drug charges after that. And I emphasize the drug aspect simply to note the type of, I would argue, unstable individuals the government is willing to work with. Because when you're in a situation like that, when you have drug abuse problems, when you have financial problems, when you have a criminal history, you have a lot of motivations to say whatever you have to say to cover your own ass. And that's why witnesses like this, confidential informants, are not reliable. You also have cases where people like Anna, who was an undercover FBI agent, she was paid by the Bureau to investigate environmental groups. She traveled the country, or she went to the Crime Think Convergence, she went to the protests up in New York, and she was with a group of people. One of them was an activist named Eric McDavid. And the whole time, Anna had financing from the FBI. She was trying to get them to blow up a dam, the Nimbus Dam. And they had no interest in it. Nothing was happening. Anna and the police were getting really frustrated by this. She's actually on tape at one point being recorded by herself saying, are we going to get serious about this or not? What do you all need? What do you all need to make this happen? She offered them hotels and bomb-making supplies, bomb-making instructions, and they just still were not taking it. Finally, they were all arrested on conspiracy charges, conspiring with an FBI informant. McDavid was sentenced to about 20 years in prison as well. He's in prison right now in California. So Eric and Marie, just a couple days ago on June 11th, there's a national day raising awareness about them and long-term anarchist prisoners. And I have information about that. It would be wonderful if you could write them a letter. 22 years is an unbelievably long amount of time in an environment like that. There are a lot of political prisoners out there, and if you could take a moment to write a letter, you don't have to know anything about them, you don't have to talk politics, you can just tell them a joke or tell them about your day, and it matters. So as all this is taking place, counterterrorism corporations are being hired. And I include this as a really important step because it illustrates how all of this takes on a life of its own. So you have millions of dollars flowing down from the federal government to the states to fight terrorism, right? And the states all want part of that money. To get the money, they have to show that they're fighting terrorism. To do that, they hire counterterrorism firms who then, what do you think happens? They identify a lot of terrorism threats. Because when you're getting paid tens of thousands of dollars, I would identify lots of terrorism threats for you. No problem. And it creates some really awful intelligence. They include things like, in Pennsylvania, animal rights activists protesting the use of carriage horses, Dominican nuns protesting the war, environmentalists protesting and holding film screenings about the movie Gasland. These appear in these intelligence bulletins that are sent around the state that further reinforce the nature of this threat, further change how law enforcement works. And it becomes this cycle. Does that make sense? So you have the money coming down, the state gives the money to corporations to help identify the threat, corporations identify whatever they're expected to identify, which then reinforces it, and it just keeps going and going. Oh, the fancy setup with the phone isn't working. At the point that new legislation is being passed that specifically singles out people because of their political beliefs, I think that's really a hallmark of any of these, what I would call these dark periods, these eras of government, severe government repression. One of the laws I wanted to talk about is the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, which is a law that, no! Okay. Oh. That was a good example of self-sabotage, FBI sabotage. Here's some of the corporations that sponsored it: GlaxoSmithKline, Pfizer, Wyeth, Covance, Fur Commission, the Center for Consumer Freedom, Pet Industry, Ringling Brothers, the biotech industry. And the only reason I found out about any of this is they had an internal website called the Animal Enterprise Protection Coalition, where they were doing all their lobbying behind the scenes, and somebody tipped me off about where this website was. And they had a login, and so being the real good muckraking investigative journalist I am, I entered the password of test and the username of test, and the thing opened up. And right on the homepage, they have like a bio about me and all this information about my website, which is real cool, right? And then they have a list of all these hundreds of corporations that are behind this legislation. And the public has no idea this is going on. That law is so broad that a according to FOIA documents we obtained, the FBI was considering terrorism prosecutions of undercover investigators as far back as 2003. This new law expands that and goes even further. Not to get too much into it, because I could give an entire presentation on that, but the law wraps up animal activists who cause a loss of profits, is the language of the legislation, to animal enterprises, either through instilling a reasonable fear in the people that are targeted. Remember all those ads? How do we talk about reasonable fear anymore? Or who disrupt the operations of these animal enterprises through protest and civil disobedience. Have you all heard of a group called ALEC?
Yeah.
So ALEC has been in the news for union busting in Wisconsin, standard ground laws in Florida. They also have a model Animal and Ecological Terrorism Act. Now, the way ALEC works, it's a corporate front group. They take tens of thousands of dollars from corporations, and in exchange for that, corporations get to go to these conferences where they draft model legislation, like this one. And then state lawmakers take the corporate bills, and I should say, while this is happening, the state lawmakers are off having dinner on the corporate dime. They're going to skeet shooting sponsored by the NRA. They're going to Broadway shows. They're going to fancy dinners, all sponsored by these corporations, the corporate sponsors. And then they take those bills back home, they stand before their colleagues in the State House of New York or wherever, and introduce them and present them as if this is something that they made up, when it's drafted by corporations. Now, the model bills don't get passed in full, but they're an example of a roadmap of where these corporations are trying to go. An example of where they're trying to go is that outlawing of people who don't destroy windows or steal animals or burn things down, let alone harm anyone, but who take photographs and videotapes of what happens on factory farms and slaughterhouses. I first started writing about these issues in 2000. Even after 9/11, I never thought that this type of legislation would be politically feasible, let alone that it would actually pass. As a quick example of why this is so important, why these investigations are so powerful, one of them in California led to the largest meat recall in U.S. history. Investigators showed workers that were using industrial equipment to move around cows that were too sick to walk, cows that were too sick to enter the food supply. Those cows were being killed, turned into meat. The meat was being sent to schools as part of the National School Lunch Program. Sick cows being fed to school kids. Investigators exposed this, led to the meat recall, and without them, we would never have known about it. It's led to criminal prosecutions for felony animal cruelty, something that years ago would never have been possible. There's no legislation that protects farm animals during their lives, not one. It's also led to damning media coverage like this one. Body slamming piglets to death, humane, pork experts say. Now you can see the problem, the PR crisis that the industry has, right? So they've introduced legislation last year in 10 states. It's passed in 3, Iowa, Utah, and Missouri. A few states already had laws on the books that were similar. This year it's been introduced in 12 states. It's been defeated in everyone except North Carolina, which is pending right now. And if there's one point to emphasize to you all tonight about this, the North Carolina bill doesn't even mention agriculture. It doesn't mention factory farming, and it doesn't mention undercover investigators from the Humane Society. It's called the Commerce Protection Act, and it includes every single industry. So think about that for a moment. You care about workers' rights? Do you care about children's rights? Do you care about environmental protection? Do you care about what's going on in your community and what products you're buying? Everything from the car you're driving to cigarettes in North Carolina, obviously, to food, to paper products. You can't expose any of that under this new legislation. Let's skip over that real fast. Now, as this is happening, it's been met with similar rhetoric from politicians. So you have members of Congress that have actually sent letters to the USDA saying undercover investigators are, quote, economic terrorism. The industry is even more nuts on this. I mean, there's no other word for it. They're out saying that this is no different. Taking photographs of animal cruelty is no different than burning crosses in people's yards. That's why it's okay to have new legislation singling it out for harsh penalties. So we quickly begin to see the evolution of these tactics, right? The movement is not just about underground actions. That's been the rhetoric that's been used for years. That same apparatus, left unchecked, is going after more and more mainstream organizations as well. Now, if there's one defining element of any state that's gone way too far, it's creating special prison units for people because of their political beliefs. There are at least 2 of these facilities in the country called communications management units. This is my friend Daniel McGowan. He was convicted of his involvement in arsons in the name of the Earth Liberation Front. Didn't harm anyone, but he was a vocal and public face to this radical movement. He was sent to one of these CMUs without any administrative procedure whatsoever. He wasn't told why he's going there or how he could be removed. These places radically restrict prisoner communications with the outside world to levels that meet or exceed some of the worst places in the country, like ADX Florence. I was able to visit Daniel as a friend, not as a journalist, because no journalists are allowed in there. We sit between bulletproof glass in a room like this. I can't shake hands, I can't give him a hug. He can't hug his wife. He can't hug his niece. He can't do anything that the Bureau of Prisons itself says is necessary for, quote, prisoner rehabilitation, right? So even to use their rhetoric, they're going against it. It's live monitored by the counterterrorism unit. When he was there, he got a handful of minutes of phone calls a month, a handful of visitation hours. And when you're in there for visits, I noticed the entire rest of the prison was quiet. There's nobody in the halls, nobody's moved around, because the rest of the prison is on lockdown. It's a prison within a prison for people because of their politics. And none of the people that are in these places, they're not the Zacharias Musawis of the world. They're not 9/11 hijackers. They're not anything that you might think of when you hear the word domestic terrorist or international terrorist. They're people like Dr. Rafiel Dafir from New York, who violated the economic sanctions on Iraq by sending medical supplies to children who were suffering under the US imposed sanctions. 5,000 kids a month were dying. He is in the CMU. So, to put it another way, the government has acknowledged that these places exist. It has said that they're, for quote, prisoners with inspirational significance. I would argue that that's a euphemism. Inspirational significance is a term that replaces political prisoners in political prisons. Now, I kind of lied. There's not just 10 steps. There's always an unspoken 11th step. That after you go through all this, you never stop. Because when you give people in power even more power to go after their opposition, they keep going. So you repeat the process. So as this has been institutionalized, and groups like PDARE being listed as domestic special interest terrorists, the FBI has training manuals, again through FOIA, in which it's describing that activists are engaged in a media war, that they sometimes spin the truth and get media in their favor. With the rise of the Occupy movement, we're seeing similar tactics being used against anarchists as well, and many other movements as well. But notice, this was really interesting to me in the presentation on anarchists by the FBI. Note this second bullet. They're simply criminals seeking an ideology to justify their activity. Now this is a political ideology that stretches back a couple hundred years, right? That's been responsible for some of the most key developments in workers' rights in this country, child labor laws, collective organizing, influencing mass movements around the world. Forget all that. They're by their definition criminal. So when you begin to define politics as intrinsically political, it makes it a lot easier to carry out all these tactics, and that's how the FBI is being trained. There were raids in the Pacific Northwest that was in search of, quote, anti-government or anarchist literature. There were grand jury resistors that were imprisoned for months for refusing to talk about their politics, talk about their friends, talk about their organizing. They were never accused of any crime, but the way a grand jury works is that if you refuse to cooperate, you can be put in jail for the duration of the grand jury, which can be 18 months. There's now, actually, I realize this is not the updated one I intended to load on the iPad because there's a new grand jury prisoner in New York City, named Jerry, who is doing the same thing. He's 22 years old. The government is saying that he was at a bar at one point where people were talking about who might have been involved in a bombing of a military recruitment center that destroyed a window and a door. And they're saying Jerry might know something about it. And Jerry's like, I'm not talking about my politics or my friends. I'm not being forced to participate in this witch hunt. So he's in jail as we speak right now. Now, it's really important to remember that these tactics that I'm talking about in the US don't exist in a vacuum. The same things are appearing internationally. Europol listed undercover investigators in its most recent report on terrorism threats to all of Europe. Activists have been arrested in Spain, Italy, France, Finland, some of them for simply doing undercover investigations in charge of terrorism. Now, I say all that because, under neoliberalism and global capitalism, we have to remember that corporations have no national boundaries. They don't care where they go to get money, right? We all know this. Like, I can get my blue jeans and my iPhone and my water bottle and dress shirts and whatever else, same place anywhere in the country, the same McDonald's, same Taco Bell. We all see this, right? We have to remember, as corporations move across countries to get profit, they can also move between countries taking those tactics of repression with them. So we're seeing the exact, and when I say exact, I mean verbatim, same things happening in Canada, in Germany, in Spain, in Austria. When I was in Austria doing speaking events, I met with a group of activists who, in their trial, they learned that the FBI actually briefed the Austrian law enforcement about how to do this. That's how direct a lot of this is. So, after all that horribly depressing information that I just dumped out, and I realized I was going at like 100 miles an hour here, what do we do about it? Now, I don't begin to act as if I have the answers to those questions, but I think I can highlight some things that I know we should be doing. One of them is to go against that fragmentation. Remember that kind of nerdy bar graph that I put up? I'm really honored to be on the board of the Rosenberg Fund for Children, which is one group that does this, I think, quite well. They were founded by the son of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were executed during the Red Scare. Their mission is to provide financial and personal and emotional support to the children of people who have been targeted because of their political beliefs. Now, Robbie Mirapol has gotten a lot of flack for this, because in those circles, they were like, why do you care about these environmentalists? Animal rights activists, like, why do we care about them? How is this related to our struggles as socialists or communists or people pushing for prison reform, all these different things? And he's done a fantastic job of making those connections. I think those are more connections we need to make. And I include this because it always makes me smile, but also I think it's a great example of, this is Miranda Gibson in Tasmania. She did a tree sit for, I forgot how many months it was, to stop this forest from being destroyed. But I love the photo because, to me, it represents the point of the book, the point of what I'm saying tonight, is not just to listen to it to go home. It's active information. This is an ongoing story. So as you're learning about these things, I hope you're learning about them. You're not up in trees, as you're up in burning books or whatever you're doing in your community. Out there organizing. They're tools that we can use to move forward in productive ways. That's another fun one from the sea shepherd. All right, that's enough dirty photos of people I admire with the book. But the message I want to leave you all with tonight is that when you hear about things like this, I think there are a couple ways of walking away from it. One of them is that all of this has been going on forever. It always will be going on forever. The government is always going to be more powerful than we are. Corporations are always going to be more powerful. We're screwed. There's nothing we can do about it. We can just try to make small inroads in here and there, but this isn't a fight we can win. I think the other message you can take from it is to shine a spotlight on exactly how this is happening, how it's worked throughout history, how it's working now, and then realize that those tactics are not unique, they're not novel, they are most certainly not brilliant. These people are not smarter than us, they're not more passionate than us. They have money and an infinite amount of resources. But what they're doing is not inevitable. And our response to it is not inevitable either. Now, part of the reason I make this comparison to the Red Scare is there were a lot of mistakes that were made then. There are a lot of mistakes that are being made now. But there's no reason we have to follow in those same footsteps. So as we're learning about these tactics, we can think about them and meet together in our communities, coordinate work across movements, work between movements, and build a stronger resistance against them. There's this quote I always love from Notes from the Underground from Dostoevsky, where he says, "The whole work of man is to determine that he is a man and not a piano key." And that always resonated with me, because I think that's the challenge we have right now. These tactics are nothing new, but when we're hit by them, we don't need to play the same note. So in that spirit, thank you all for having me here tonight, and I really look forward to talking to you in this discussion.